Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Ken Dark. And today we're going to be talking about first century Nazareth, but we're also going to discuss a little bit about Nazareth in the following centuries after the first century. So let's start off with this. What do we know about first century Nazareth?
Well, we know a lot more than we used to do because the textual sources, the written sources, don't tell us very much at all about first century Nazareth. Really, the only extended description, if you can call it that, is in Luke's Gospel. And that really tells us almost nothing about the physical state of Nazareth in the first century. It tells us that Nazareth was in some way on or on the slopes of, or something like that, a hill. Well, Lower Galilee is pretty hilly. It's typical of settlements there that they might be on a hill or on the slopes of a hill. That's nothing new. People could terrace buildings into hillsides in first century Galilee. They often did. So, yeah, that's kind of consistent with what we might expect. It tells us that somehow there was a steep slope adjacent to this hill, because the villagers or the occupants of first century Nazareth tried to throw Jesus off it and he escaped. Well, yeah, there are lots of very steep slopes in the Lower Galilean landscape, including in the landscape in and around Nazareth, and present Nazareth. And it says that the settlement had a synagogue. What that means in a first century village context, if it is in a village, which we always assume it is almost anybody's guess. Synagogue in this period, I'm reliably informed by people who studied this stuff, could mean just an assembly of people outside. It need not be a building, but it could be a building. It actually, could be a structure. So in written sources, we have very little information about first century Nazareth. I suppose you could add to this that saying it had a synagogue strongly implies that it was all or some of the people, that's all or some of the people in Nazareth were Jewish, because why else would you have a synagogue? And of course, there's the reference to someone being a tekton, whatever that means, in first century Nazareth in the description of Joseph. And tekton can mean carpenter. You can see that translated all over the place in biblical translations and studies, but it can also mean anybody involved in the, if you like, construction trade. It could mean somebody who was involved in quarrying, working in stone, working in wood, anything to do with building. And buildings in first century Galilee tend to be either wholly or partly comprised of stone, and often, if not most times, involving wooden elements. So again, that there's a tekton in first century Nazareth, according to Luke, doesn't go really beyond what we'd expect. We'd expect people involved in building. I mean, people have got to have houses. We would expect village craftspeople. We would expect also there to be an agricultural population, but Luke doesn't actually say that there's an agricultural population in first century Nazareth, although we would assume that from where Nazareth is and what kind of landscape it has. And this is really what biblical scholars, to lump them all together, have said for over 100 years about Nazareth based on written texts. They've essentially painted the picture that I've just outlined, and that's as far as you can go from written sources. It's not wrong, but it's very, very limited. And of course, even if you add to that the natural landscape around present Nazareth, or around the centre of present Nazareth, you don't get very, very much further. You get to realise that there was a wadi or vadi running through what's now the centre of Nazareth. In the first century, it's very well attested, both in archaeology and in pictorial sources of post-medieval, of modern date, because it was there until the 19th century. And so we have pictures of it, we have some archaeological evidence for it, and it's a steep-sided seasonal river valley. And if you wanted to throw somebody to their death anywhere in the centre of Nazareth, it seems to me quite likely that you'd throw them down that wadi, which had steep slopes. So again, not inconsistent with the texts, but it doesn't really add much to the texts to look at the natural topography. So when we get beyond this is when we start taking into consideration archaeological evidence, and it's really been in the last, I suppose, 50 years that archaeology has made any headway into understanding what first century Nazareth was like.
Could Luke be describing the Nazareth in his time? A lot of scholars tend to date Luke either to the 90s of the first century CE or in the early second century CE. Is there archaeology of Nazareth that covers that time period as well that might appear to correlate to Luke's description?
Well, when you get into the archaeological evidence, we have now a pile of archaeology for the early first century and the first century as a whole in Nazareth. We have buildings, at least 2 surface-built structures at the International Marian Centre, which I often call the IMC site. It's a bit of a mouthful to say International Marian Centre all the time, and at the Sisters of Nazareth site, which, as you probably know, as your audience probably knows, I've done a lot of work on myself. And those structures date from the first century, including the early first century. And the International Marian Centre site goes on a bit longer than the Sisters of Nazareth site. It seems it may well even go on through the first century into the second century. Anyway, away from those 2 actual houses, we have some more functional, as in non-domestic functional structures, artificial cavities, artificial caves, if you like, agricultural installations, storage installations carved into the natural limestone, which is very chalky in Nazareth. It's a good material to either chop up into blocks and build things out of, or to burrow down into to make subterranean cavities or caverns for various purposes. And of course, there's a great advantage in going underground, if you like, in Galilee. Certainly in the summer, it's much cooler, and in the winter, it's an easy way of keeping things out of the rain, because Galilee, in general, does get and has in previous centuries received a lot of rain compared to most places in the region. And that's why it's strikingly agriculturally fertile. It's a place where crops grow well, where there's plenty of water for animals, and so much rainfall, in fact, that historically known settlements have existed using rainfall capture as their water supply. And this is something people often overlook if they're sitting at home in Western Europe or North America and thinking about the Middle East. They tend to think of it all very, very hot, kind of almost a desert environment, but it isn't. And there are bits of Lower Galilee, where Nazareth is, that certainly in this winter and spring remind me a bit of England. And nobody could claim England is a desert country. So we have an environment in which agriculture can flourish, and plenty of evidence, plenty of archaeological evidence from first century Nazareth that agricultural activities were indeed flourishing there. So that's a big part of the evidence, but also we've got objects that date from the first century, quite a lot of pottery now, limestone vessels, which, although they go on into later centuries, are typical of first century Jewish settlement in the Holy Land, and also other portable objects. So we've got quite a lot of evidence for first century Nazareth, and we just don't have to rely on any texts. If we did rely on the texts, we wouldn't have much to go on, and it would be possible to claim, for example, that Luke was making the whole thing up. Whereas, if you've stood within the ruins of an archaeologically datable first century building in Nazareth, holding typically first century pottery in your hands, cooking pottery, albeit broken pieces of it, what archaeologists call sherds, it's really pretty difficult to take at all seriously the idea that Nazareth wasn't there in the first century, including the early first century. So there's a lot of evidence. But obviously, the more archaeological work that goes on, assuming the relevant deposits are preserved, the more evidence we'll have. And I certainly would welcome a lot more excavation, a lot more archaeological study of Nazareth. But that will probably only come through what we in the UK and many other places call rescue archaeology, which I think you call in North America salvage archaeology, archaeology ahead of construction. And that is going to principally be coming out of the Israel Antiquities Authority, IAA excavations, because they have a marvelous program of rescue archaeology run by some very competent archaeologists. and they're really covering the whole of present Israel with their program of rescue archaeology, including Nazareth and its hinterland. And some very important excavations of that type have been done around Nazareth and especially in terms of the IMC side, in the centre of Nazareth. So we can hope for more in future.
What do we know about the population levels of first century Nazareth during Jesus' time?
Almost nothing, actually. Apart from saying that there are people there, we can't really say any number for the population, because the intensity of occupation is really unknown to us, except on the very few sites that have been excavated, where it does seem to be quite intensely occupied. And the extent of the settlement is not known at all. It used to be thought that we knew the limits of first century Nazareth very well, because they were ringed by Jewish tombs which wouldn't have been built inside a settlement and had therefore to have been built outside the settlement of Nazareth. The problem is, archaeologically speaking, those Jewish tombs, although sometimes of a somewhat old-fashioned character compared to those further south, really are dating from the mid-1st century onwards. So what we know about the Jewish tombs is fascinating for late 1st century, 2nd century, even 3rd century possibly, Nazareth. But those tombs start with tombs that we can date by the form of the tomb, sometimes even possibly by associated objects, to the middle and later part of the 1st century. To put it another way, the tombs weren't there when Jesus was walking about in Nazareth. Where people were buried and how is another question. Probably they weren't being buried in rock-cut tombs at this point, because rock-cut tombs may have been associated with wealthier people. There's a debate over that, which I'm not going to get into today. But a definitively early 1st century rock-cut tomb has not been found in central Nazareth. And that means that, obviously, if the tombs are later than the early 1st century, you can't use them to delineate, to draw a circle around 1st century, early 1st century Nazareth, because they're not there at the time.
And how does Nazareth start to change when you look at the late 1st century and then look into the 2nd century forward?
There's a lot more evidence, material evidence, of wealth. Not only the form of these tombs and the number of them, there really are quite a lot of the tombs known compared to other settlements in 1st and 2nd century Lower Galilee. But the objects that we do have associated with them, and these tombs have been found, and objects have been found within them by people who were not trained archaeologists, even by the standards of their own time, from the 19th century through to the middle of the 20th century. A few have been found more recently. Anyway, the point is that these objects are often things that were luxuries or could have been luxuries in the later 1st century and 2nd century, compared to evidence from other sites. So, for example, one of the things that I've been able to track down are a whole series of glass vessels which seem to have been found in the tombs of Nazareth. And they run from the 1st century, the presumably mid to late 1st century, straight the way through the Roman period and into the Byzantine period. And these glass vessels have been scattered by antiquity sales and 19th century collectors and so forth all over the world. You've got lots in the US, we've got lots in the UK, and then there are some in museums in other countries. So what I've done is track down, through using museum records, those glass vessels that can be securely dated and securely identified as coming from tombs in Nazareth. And when you see those, they really do indicate quite a bit of wealth, and that backs up the indications of wealth from the very few tombs. Ironically, one of them about 30 meters away from the old Church of the Annunciation, the one that got knocked down to build the present one. Given that 1st century evidence for occupation was found on the Church of the Annunciation site, that immediately casts doubt into the whole, doubt on the whole. If there are tombs, there's no occupation thing. Even that one has quite high status, if you like, objects within it. So it seems that Nazareth is a poorer place when Jesus was there than it was, let's say, 100 years later. And the obvious explanation for this is found in written sources or textual sources generally, that suggest that one of the priestly families after the first revolt relocated, in effect, as refugees to Nazareth. And they may well be the tip of the iceberg of people of wealth coming into Nazareth and other settlements in Galilee. It's almost certain that this kind of influx did occur, and bringing with them not only greater wealth, but further customs from the area around and indeed within 1st century Jerusalem. And so the difference between the Nazareth of Jesus, if you like, as my recent book calls it, Jesus is Nazareth, and the Nazareth of the late 1st century and the 2nd century would be pretty striking if you could go back in time and see the two settlements.
You mentioned that that you know of a late Roman pilgrim, a Western Roman called Egeria, had written about a cave church in the 380s, and she said it had a well and was where the Virgin Mary had once lived. What do you make of that?
Well, I think we can pretty much take that description as what she saw, or what a person represented to us as Egeria saw. But it is intriguing because it fits the evidence from the Sisters of Nazareth site, where there's a cave church from which the earliest datable material is 4th century. Well, there's a late 3rd century coin, but that could have been in use in the 4th century. And that site has a well. Very, very few places in what's now the city of Nazareth, what was then certainly the settlement of Nazareth and its immediate environs, do have wells. There are lots of springs in the Galilean hills, including the hills outside Nazareth, but inside Nazareth there are only, well, 3 or 4, depending upon what you think was inside Nazareth. There's the one at the Sisters of Nazareth site. There was one identified in World War I, but now lost, in the west of the then city of Nazareth. And there's a well called the Apostles' Fountain, which, strangely enough, I've actually seen the place where it is. It's now marked by a standpipe. Believe it or not, not a well structure. But as I say, strangely, I've heard quite well informed people say that it doesn't exist. Well, that I think they need to go back and look on the ground in Nazareth if they think that. There is another well in Nazareth called Mary's Well, or St. Mary's Well. It's known by both names. And that well is described by Egeria in the late 4th century, as you say, as being outside the settlement of her time. So whether that was in 1st century Nazareth or whether it wasn't is a very debatable question. I think it was outside 1st century Nazareth. I think it's probably the focus of another adjacent settlement, because there is 1st century evidence around it, but there's a gap in which you don't find any Roman period pottery at all between that evidence, that cluster around Mary's Well, and the cluster of 1st century and indeed later Roman evidence in the centre of what's now Nazareth. And that seems to me to indicate 2 separate settlements, which is consistent with what Egeria said. So whereas people often say, oh, Mary's Well was the well of 1st century Nazareth, I think it probably wasn't. Though people from 1st century Nazareth might well have used it. I don't think that was the water source they were closest to. However, of those 3 wells in central Nazareth, the Sisters of Nazareth site has a cave church, probably dating from the 4th century, might be a bit earlier, couldn't be a lot earlier, but might be a bit earlier. And it has this well, and it was later considered, it seems, as the site of the house that Jesus was brought up in by Mary and Joseph. And we have the earliest attestation to that is in De Locis Sanctis, which is a text almost exactly 300 years later than Egeria. So whether Egeria is, as I think she is, preserving an earlier version of the same story, whether it's true or not, an earlier version of the same story, that was the place where Joseph, Mary, and Jesus had once lived, or whether she was recording something different, is debatable. Again, all of these things could be debated, but there seems a weight of probability in favour of particular interpretations, in my opinion. So that's where we stand on that question, really. And of course, that relates to the much discussed question of whether the first century house at the Sisters of Nazareth, what I call Structure 1, was actually considered, at least in the 7th century, and probably therefore in the Byzantine period, which had just ended, to be the dwelling place of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph in the 1st century. And I think the balance of probability is that the Byzantines built such a grand church there, of which archaeological evidence indeed, because of that story. Now, whether that story was true in a historical sense is a different question, and a question we're not really able to answer today. It could have just been made up. It could have been based on a dream, visionary experience that people thought was true. It could have been a true story. There are many, many instances of places being remembered as associated with historical figures for much longer than it would take for Jesus's house to be remembered in the 4th century. But it doesn't mean to say it was. So my own position on this, which has often been misrepresented actually, is that we don't know. We just don't know. But I'm not going to, what always infuriates people who want a clear-cut answer over this, is I'm not going to say it was or it wasn't, because I think we don't know. And some people get very annoyed that I won't say it is the very house of Jesus, and other people get very annoyed that I won't say it was certainly not the house of Jesus and was something either of a different character or much later. It seems to me that the archaeological case for it being 1st century, and probably towards the earlier part of the 1st century, given the 1st century sequence it's part of, is pretty good. And so far as I'm concerned, what we can say is that it's a 1st century house lived in by people following Jewish purity customs, because there were limestone vessels there, and who had a little bit of disposable wealth because there were manufactured goods, which seemed to be associated with the 1st century occupation. But they are domestic items. I mean, they're pottery that you could buy at market rather than luxury items. And there is a spindle whorl, and a pottery disc with a hole in it, used as part of spinning apparatus for spinning textile. So that was a characteristically female activity in 1st century Galilee. So at least one woman was probably there. It's most likely it was a family home. But whether that family was the family of Jesus or any other Nazareth family of the first century is beyond archaeology.
And what does Nazareth start to look like after the Byzantine period?
Yeah, so it's very interesting that Byzantine Nazareth is developed as a pilgrim centre. We didn't really know that from any written source. We could have guessed it, but again, texts could be used to argue that it wasn't really developed, because pilgrims tend not to mention Nazareth. Indeed, nobody tends to mention Nazareth for centuries at a time. And yet we've found evidence for at least 2 elaborate churches there, probably a third at Mary's Well, which American excavations found, but has not really been published in very much detail. And those churches wouldn't have existed in a vacuum. There would have been a settlement there. There would have been other buildings. And there were fragmentary buildings around the Sisters of Nazareth site, in the adjacent streets, and around the Church of the Annunciation, which could date from this period and could represent fairly substantial structures. That Byzantine settlement might well have been a small town, or maybe even something they would have thought of as a city, because it had these grand churches and was a focal place. But then again, when we get into the early Islamic period, and bear in mind, De Locis Sanctis dates from the early Islamic period, although it's a Christian text and describes Christian places, it was written in reference to observations made in the early Islamic period. In that period, Christian activity in Nazareth seems to continue, and there's quite a lot of evidence, archaeological evidence and some textual evidence, that Christian activity continues in Nazareth for centuries under Islamic occupation. It may not always be a smooth coexistence, but it's a continuation. And then when the Crusaders come along, they obviously place greater importance on Nazareth and rebuild some of the churches that have fallen into disrepair. That includes the Sisters of Nazareth Church, which seems to have gone out of use maybe the 10th and 11th centuries. And when the Crusaders arrive in Nazareth at the end of the 11th century, they find it in at least a dilapidated, if not a disused state. And they rebuild it. And they rebuild the Church of the Annunciation as a splendid medieval European style cathedral. And they have lots of other substantial stone buildings in what is certainly a very, very significant and sizable settlement in the 12th century. And there are references. We haven't got archaeological evidence for this, I think, but there are references to walls being in existence around the town of Nazareth by the end of the 12th century. So we have effectively a Crusader town. Now, that in turn is badly damaged at the end of the Crusader period and comes again under Islamic control. But again, Christian activity there is not completely extinguished. It goes on in a much reduced state. And quite what happens at the Sisters of Nazareth site is unclear. Certainly the big church is very much destroyed and dilapidated, and it's a cessation of the Crusader pattern of worship. If you excuse me, Jacob, for a moment, I must turn on this battery, which this electrical supply, which will stop my picture from disappearing.
No problem.
We have a situation where the battery is running low, according to my computer. Anyway, having sorted that out, we then have Nazareth existing as a fairly minor town in Galilee under Ottoman rule, and benefiting in the 19th century and later from the pilgrimage of Christians. But it's never become a really major tourist centre. People often, again, think when they write about it, having not spent any time there, that, oh, well, yes, Nazareth must make a fortune out of pilgrimage or tourism. But actually, most of Nazareth's visitors are day visitors coming by coach from other places where they're staying. So there are not huge numbers of hotels. There are hotels, but there are not huge numbers of them. There are not huge numbers of tourist facilities, although there are tourist shops in the centre of Nazareth. So today, the economy of Nazareth is very much tied into the local economy of Galilee, so far as I can see, although obviously I'm an archaeologist, not an economist.
And how does let me rephrase that. Does it appear that Christians are giving more and more attention to Nazareth throughout the centuries?
Well, it's a difficult question. There's certainly more written evidence when you get into the modern period, but in fact, one of the really strangest things, positively weird thing about first millennium Nazareth is how little it's mentioned in written texts, even Christian written texts. People seldom record more than its existence, if that. And so the history, the written history of Nazareth, contains lots and lots of substantial gaps. In fact, it's true to say that first century Nazareth, because of the Gospels, is better documented in written texts than Nazareth when it was a 5th century bishop's seat in the very Christian Byzantine Empire. So by the token of people who say, oh, well, there were very few texts for first century Nazareth, so it must have been either not there or a very minor place, you would say that of Nazareth around AD 500. But we know there was a Byzantine bishop based there in the 470s or the late 5th century. So Byzantine bishop seats were not insignificant places in the Byzantine Empire, which was as I said, a very Christian state. It was a state with its state religion, Orthodox Christianity, and substantial state support for the Orthodox Church. So this kind of textual absence, and it goes on throughout the first millennium, does make one wary of using the lack of evidence as evidence of absence of anything so far as Nazareth is concerned. It really is true where Nazareth is concerned that that old phrase, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So archaeology has really enabled us to show that in recent years. It's remarkable how much we've been finding in a place which is barely documented throughout most of the time that archaeological evidence covers. The Crusade of Nazareth is a bit better documented, but not much actually, but a bit better.
JM, thank you for your super chat and the thumbs up. If anybody else has questions, well, feel free to super chat. Does that start to change more significantly in the post-Crusader period? Does Nazareth start getting a lot more mentions and a lot more attention after the Crusades?
Not really. Nazareth is on the European cognitive map, so to speak, in the Crusader period and after. But there's not really an outcry about things going on in Nazareth. There are people saying this should happen or this shouldn't happen in Nazareth. There are descriptions by visitors. There are descriptions by Catholic missionaries to Nazareth, which really bear out what we might have otherwise guessed. It still had a Christian population. It still had places that were either active or were remembered as Christian places of worship. In fact, the church at the Sisters of Nazareth may have been remembered by the Christians of Nazareth between its destruction by fire in the late 12th century and the arrival of the Sisters of Nazareth themselves, the nuns, in the mid-19th century. Because when the nuns bought the land that the convent stands on, a local person informed them that this was a good place for them to buy because it had been the site of a great church containing a saint's tomb. Well, that pretty much would describe what we know about the Crusader Church on the Sisters of Nazareth site. Whether this represented an authentic local tradition or whether it was just something this local person was saying to bump up the price of the land or whatever, we don't know. But there's a really serious chance that it was remembered as the site of a great church over hundreds of years without any kind of documentation, without any inscription so far as we know. And certainly in the 19th century, we have an account of people, local people, lighting lamps that were deposited at the Sisters of Nazareth site, where there was nothing at the time. So this might have been considered a holy place, even though there was no church there, even though the last church or vestige of the saint's tomb had been destroyed at the end of the 12th century.
Can you tell us a bit about the Cenex interpretation?
Oh, Cenex was a Jesuit priest who studied the Sisters of Nazareth site, really more so than Nazareth as a whole, though he was interested in Nazareth as a whole, for most of his adult life. He was an interesting man. He was trained as an architect, and so far as I can find out,
I think we lost his connection. Don't know yet. We'll wait a moment and see if he comes back up. There we go.
Again. Yes, this room I'm in has a variable power supply. So Cenex was trained as an architect, and so far as I can find out, he came from a family of very prominent architects in the French city of Marseille. Indeed, his relative, I think probably his father, was the architect who designed one of the principal architectural wonders, if you like, of Marseille, a monumental staircase. And so he was apparently intended throughout his life to pursue a career throughout his early life to pursue a career in architecture, and only in, I think it was his late 20s, became a member of the Catholic clergy. So he took his architectural skills to combine with an interest in biblical archaeology. And that first led him to various excavations, but very quickly, after he arrived in the Holy Land, to work at the Sisters of Nazareth, convent. And of course, it's a Roman Catholic convent. And so as a Jesuit, he would have been welcomed, he would have been fully accepted within that community. Now, the big difference for the convent is that until Cenex started working there in the late 1930s, The nuns themselves had done all the archaeology. Well, with an exception of one very strange incident in which two men claiming to be Catholic clergy had excavated seemingly the whole of the floor of the best preserved tomb, the tomb I call Tomb 1, which cuts through the first century house and the first century quarrying, for that matter, which followed the house. So the two chaps involved presented themselves as clergy to the nuns, quite senior clergy, and conducted this excavation. This was before Cenex time, but not much before. And they said they found nothing, and yet they took away from the convent some of the coins the nuns had found. When they had apparently returned to Rome, the convent superior, the Sisters of Nazareth, call the head of their convent the superior, not the mother superior. The convent superior actually wrote to the church authorities in Rome, I think probably saying, "Can we have our coins back, please?" And to her amazement and to the bafflement of the convent, the church authorities had no knowledge of these two apparent clergy. And so it seems that these were a couple of con men pretending to be Catholic clergy, pretending to be archaeologists, and were there for treasure, really, that for valuable antiquities. And without a doubt, the nuns had found gold, coins, and other valuable objects. None are there now. I mean, they've long gone. Because, first of all, there were a series of thefts, such as that one. Second, when the Turkish army occupied the convent in World War I, there was widespread looting, it seems, of the convent museum in which these things were stored. And also, the nuns were in the habit, that's not a dreadful pun, but it was their custom to give pilgrims and interested visitors antiquities as sort of souvenirs throughout most of the history of the convent after they'd stopped excavating and before our work in 2006 and later. So even when I was writing my first Sisters of Nazareth book, people were contacting me saying, I stayed at the convent in such and such a previous decade and was given antiquities only before the State of Israel existed. That is, but because the nuns are very law-abiding, but as one would expect from nuns, I suppose. But before the State of Israel, that situation certainly existed. So things have gone, and ironically, the things that have gone have been, on the one hand, the most valuable things, such as these gentlemen who excavated the tomb, will have taken. And things have gone to pilgrims, to religious visitors, because they either were or were believed by the nuns to have early Christian or first century associations. So it's ironical that this practice deprived us as archaeologists of a lot of the evidence we'd most like to have. I mean, loads of objects are mentioned as being Byzantine or being Roman, which we certainly couldn't locate within the convent museum or anywhere in Nazareth. I mean, these things have gone. One day, maybe some will resurface. I have slight hopes that the collection, which was transported to France at the outbreak of World War II for safekeeping, might one day reappear. I don't know where, and I don't know to whom in France it was sent. I wouldn't be surprised if it was sent via Cenex contacts to Marseille, but that's just a guess, because there's nothing in the archives. The nuns know nothing that would identify where that material went, and that probably comprised what they thought, as of 1939, was the as it were, best material in the museum. So we'd probably like to see it, actually. But I don't hold out massive hope of ever doing so. But I think it's possible. I think it's possible that will resurface somewhere in an identifiable form. Most of the rest of the material, I think it's unlikely, if it still exists, we'll be able to identify as being from the Sisters of Nazareth. And that's a shame. It's a great shame because, as I say, the stuff we've lost is intrinsically likely to have been what we might think was the most interesting stuff.
And my closing question, what are recurrent projects going on at Nazareth right now that you can tell us about?
So far as I know, there's no archaeological work going on in Nazareth at the moment. If there is, I don't know about it, but it's likely that as construction goes on, there will be new IAA, Israel Antiquities Authority, rescue excavations in Nazareth, and hopefully they'll find much more evidence of not just the first century settlement, I would hope they find that, but also the later Roman, Byzantine, and Crusader settlements, which we could really do with more evidence for. I mean, we know they're there, we know something about them, but for example, we haven't got a single Byzantine or Crusader house from Nazareth. There must have been many, and it would be quite nice to have some archaeological evidence for them.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Ken.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe
and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.